Hello, BookTube. We're here live with Brandy at Eclectic and Scott Danielson, and we're here to discuss City, or more specifically, the first two tales in City, and that is the title, story, City, and the second one, Huddling Place.
Hmm.
And I'm doing this as sort of a read along for the month and two tales every week, and it's well, there's nine tales in total, but we'll be uh, talking mostly just about the first two.
Hmm.
So
That's
now,
an interesting thing they picked for the cover of that one.
Yeah, it
yeah,
looks like a
and,
spider.
It's an
and
ant. It's an
it's
ant.
an ant.
hmm
Was
I
it
know
a-
where
oh,
it,
it's
I
an
know where
ant.
it comes from, but that's an interesting choice. Out of
Yeah.
everything that they could have been chosen,
hmm
an
Yeah,
ant is
I'm
an interesting one.
airborne. There's some that are very different. There is. Oh, I just got to reach over. This here, which was
Yeah,
the
there you go. That's
Mario volume, but I don't know why they put a sort of full-fledged city in the background.
better.
They always do that,
Yeah.
and it's not really there.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a few people. Aaron's here. Hello,
Hello,
Aaron.
Aaron.
Hi, Aaron.
So yeah, so this is the first time you're reading it, Brandy,
Yeah.
and Scott. You said that it
Yeah,
might.
it's been if I had read this before, it's been so long that it's all new. I know I've owned this book for a long, long time, so I I'd be surprised if I didn't pick it up as a teenager. But this is definitely the first time as an adult, and I'm loving it. I say one of my favorite authors is Ted Chiang, who writes philosophical science fiction. And this is definitely philosophical science fiction. It's the kind that I like best. Yeah, this is a book that spurs a lot of thought. It's really good.
Scott,
And
do you have your physical book there?
I do not have a physical copy. I have an ebook.
Oh, okay, I got you.
hmm Yeah.
yeah, it's basically been in print since it was published in 1952, except for a little while in I think the late 80s and early 90s. But it's been in
Mhm.
print since then. I'll just I guess I'll just start with sort of a bit of a overall view of the book. It's a fix-up novel, and for anyone who's not sure that term, it's a novel that is literally fixed up or made up of short stories, usually sometimes rewritten or having additional material linking the stories. And in this case, there's some rewriting and there's linking material, which
Mm.
is we'll get to in a moment. But it was published in book form by Gnome Press in 1952. The stories were originally published in the 40s. The first four were published in 1944, and the last three in 1946. Or well, the not the last three, because there were original eight stories
Mm.
published, and then in 1973 he added a final story in a volume called the John W. Campbell Memorial Volume, and
Were these all in Astounding?
all except the Simple Way, as it was originally titled Trouble with Ants, and
Mm.
that was actually published in Amazon's Amazing Stories sister magazine called uh, Fantastic Adventures in 1951. John W. Campbell rejected it.
Mm.
Keanu S. Thank you, and Joseph D.
Hello.
Good evening.
Hi all.
But yeah, the actual first story that was written was the fourth tale, Desertion, and that was written in 1943, and Simak received $50 for it.
Wow.
Yeah,
Nice.
but that was held back until the other stories were published, and then it was published as the fourth story. And the city story that we'll be talking about was published in May 1944, and Huddling Place was in July 1944.
Hmm.
And
So, was Epilogue ever published in a magazine, or was it
no,
only? Okay,
it was published in the book in the Memorial volume,
okay,
and
but not anyplace else.
yeah, Simak didn't really want to write it, but because it was it was a memorial volume for Campbell that he did, but he never wanted it to really be part of the city stories. He didn't think it really fit in, and
Yeah.
it wasn't only until 1980, I think it was, or early 80s, that it finally showed up in the collections. So anything pre 1980, it's not going to have it.
I see.
And there's some differences in the original stories that were published in the magazine form and the book form they took in 1952.
Well, you'll have to tell us what the differences are, because I of course don't know what the differences are.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, but I guess the last thing I want to talk about is the structure is this interstitial material where he creates a fictional argument sort of and discussion of these stories by fictitious editors, but the editors are dogs, which are will eventually become part of the story. But it's a bit of a parody because because we know as readers what the stories actually mean, but to the dogs and their society, there's things that are it just doesn't make sense. Man,
Yeah,
what is
yeah.
what is humanity? What is war and what is a city? None of these things make sense. And there's the argument that goes through between he talks about other academics uh, discussing the stories and saying that humans are the narrative framework that is created in order to get this story across, which is kind of interesting because Simak uses the framework of the dogs to get his ideas across. So I find that kind of working back on itself, and it makes different layers for understanding the story as well, because it really pushes his ideas because he was disillusioned with the world and humanity because of the Second World War and especially Hiroshima. But we'll get to that because if you remember, I said the first stories were written in 1944, so that was before Hiroshima. But there's changes that he retrospectively put in later for the book form, for the book stories.
Oh, wow. So there's the version that I read have those changes in it, and the version I read was in an ebook.
Yeah, those.
Okay, so I read the changed ones. Very good. Hello.
So does either one of you want to describe, or do you want me to describe like the first story of where?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it's set in 1990, and it's at a time where there's the cities, people are leaving the city because of personal personal airplanes, personal or family helicopters, that you don't need to travel to your place of business. You don't need to be next door to your place of business. You can remotely work and remotely do business. And the hydroponics has allowed cheap food to be made. So therefore, farmland has become redundant and therefore cheap. So everybody is leaving the city and setting up their own sort of family estates on whichever size. The rich can obviously have bigger ones, but there's still holdovers that want to keep the city going. And it's a story of begins with the Webster family, and the first relation that Gramp Stevens is the first person we see, who's the father-in-law of John Webster. And John Webster works for the city, but he's sort of getting tired of this. He's got friends that are farmers who are trying to struggle and keep on, but nobody wants to buy produce that is growing in the ground. They think that everything hydroponic is better. And then so these people are displaced. They are they're displaced off their land, so they're squatting in the city houses that no one else wants, that everybody else has left. So the city wants to get rid of them because they feel them as they're a problem. And there's discussions that are interesting between the city people, or the people that are running the city now, and John Webster. But also, too, John Webster sort of tells them that they're idiots, and then he
Mhm.
loses his job, and then he goes to a place called the uh, it's sort of re-education thing of getting people to accept the changes in technology. And a big part of this is that he tells them that they could have waited and introduced technology like atomic power, robot, cheap construction materials, all this kind of stuff, technology, slowly to allow people to adjust to it, or to do it quickly and then try to adjust people to the new technology. And that's one of the themes that is with Simak, because of technology, and people cannot keep up with technology, and uh, they can't adjust properly, and people are left behind.
Mhm.
And the changes that I was saying, because he talks about Simak, another theme is the city. He thinks that the city has outlived its usefulness. It originally was the people huddled together, that came together for safety and for commerce. But now you've got, well, he says the automobile started that in the early 20th century, where people then moved from the city to the suburbs. But then now with the family airplanes, they don't need to live there. And then plus with the hydroponics, cheap land, you don't need to be in the city.
Mm.
So therefore, you can commute into your workplace or the factories, and you can live more free and have more space. And as a consequence of that, because of atomic warfare, atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, cities are not, they're not there, so therefore there's no target for atomic bombs and for an atomic war. And that's the key. It's not war itself, it's atomic war. And the changes are in the story, the original story that was published in May 1944, when Grant Stevens is talking to Henry Adams, who's come to look nostalgically at his grandfather's house. He talks about, he just says that, yeah, my grandfather got in sort of into atomic power quickly, at the beginning. And that's all it's said in the original story. But
Mhm.
in the published version, he goes on and says, uh, it says, yeah, he was messed up with atomic power. Gramps, Steve Gramp said, Gramp. That's right, said Adams. Got into it just as soon as it was released to industry, right after the Moscow Agreement, right after they decided they couldn't fight a war. That's right, said Adams. It's pretty hard to fight a war when there's nothing you can aim at. You mean the cities? Sure. A funny thing about it, wave all the atom bombs you wanted to, and you couldn't scare them out, but give them cheap land and family planes, and they scattered just like so many dad burned rabbits. So they couldn't get people, you know, to do anything like that, to leave this. Well, it's not that it was probably a plan to get people out of the cities. It's just a side product, because
Yeah, yeah.
they're able to have free land. And then the other change is when John Webster is talking to his his boss, like the mayor of the city, and he goes into a little more detail before he walks out, and uh, he talks about let me see, I'm just trying to find it here. Uh, yeah, he talks about that. Uh, he talks about that because it was a byproduct, and these people are lamenting the death of the city, but he's saying it's actually good that you should celebrate it, because if it didn't happen, we would have had an atomic war, and it stopped the atomic war because the side effect was that. And in the original story, it's just simply he just says that, you're crazy, basically, and walks out.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's interesting. First of all, I haven't heard the word dad burned for a long time, so that was
Yeah.
yeah. He uses it a couple times, and I
Mhm.
thought that was awesome. But yeah,
Yeah.
that was super interesting to me because I live here in northern Utah, Logan, Utah, and I was told by a police chief one time that our population doubles in size every day for the people that drive in from, because we're surrounded by rural area, so people that drive in to go to work, um, it doubles the size, doubles the population of the city, not the size, right? So that kind of stuff is happening here. And then the second thing I thought was super interesting. He's talking about family planes, and we always wonder where our flying cars are because we're in 2024, for heaven's sakes. But they are working on that. They are working on, we have a local company that's working on batteries for flying, for airplanes and drones that would carry people. And I know that here in town, land is very expensive. And if you could live 45 miles away but have a short commute, which I realize that people in cities right now have a longer commute than 45 minutes, but that's the thing in Utah. When you drive 60 miles, it takes you 60 minutes or so, and a lot of people have that much of a commute, and they're not nearly that far away.
Yeah.
But we have, but once those things actually occur, then I would imagine, like other technology, starting with rich people, you'll have palatial estates that they can. Actually, I guess that's already happening. You see that, but they can fly wherever they want,
Mhm.
and eventually, it moves down into folks. The price of that stuff goes down, and then eventually, so I don't know what effect that'll have on society, but it made me think about all that. It's
Which
not
were
a
really
it's
good
not a bad
thoughts.
prediction. Yeah.
Scott, when you were first telling me about the carrying of people and everything,
Mhm.
because the conversation started about drones, I was literally imagining like giant hooks getting people under the arms and carrying them from
There you go. Yeah. Heck, you can go on YouTube right now and find drones that fly people around. They're
Yeah.
working on them. So
Well, they're already doing that with packages. Like the
mhm.
Yeah.
packages
Yeah.
are little robots.
Right.
Yeah.
And then during COVID, how many people switched remote
Yeah.
and were able to do a lot of the things that they do remotely? I mean, look at us right
Yeah.
now.
The thing is, like the story, like I see a lot of criticism about City, like the stories, because his predictions weren't correct, and I always roll an eye at that a bit, because that's not the purpose. The
Yeah.
purpose is he's like you said, Scott. It's a philosophical story, so
Yeah.
he's working on contrivances to get that
Mhm.
philosophy
Yeah.
across.
Yeah. He's creating the conditions with which to discuss these ideas.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and then that's within the stories, but then the reflection of the dogs as well, of trying to figure out, like, well,
Mhm.
what is a city, like,
Yeah.
why are men like this, why are men like this, why is humanity like this, and
Right.
why would you group together in a city that just doesn't make, you know sociologically any sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this reinforces his idea for this.
Yeah, and it makes sense on a bunch of levels too, because you can look at this as a story of change, and I mean we're living in a time right now of it's hard not to compare it with the time we're living in, even though it was written in 1944, but
Mhm.
but it's like the incredible pace of change and how it affects people, and how some are highly resistant to it.
Yeah,
Um,
I could easily imagine that conflict taking place. The people who were living, sort of off the land and everything, being very resistant to this idea of moving away and sort of isolating every individual family. I could easily believe that as being a conflict in that situation.
Yeah,
yeah.
and the other thing that's interesting is, because that discussion with, I just remembered the name, it's the Bureau of Adjustment,
Yeah.
and they don't really get into what the adjustment is. because they make it sound like there could be some kind of psychological adjustment, and he like Simak just leaves that sort of hanging,
open to interpretation. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's the other thing too, because he doesn't give details all the time of everything that's happening. But that also fits in because he's covered his ass in many ways by creating these as tales, as fragments of a bigger story.
Mm.
And that's what the dog editors are saying. These are
Yeah.
the probable of a larger story, and we're not getting everything full. But then others say, well, no, it's just completely allegorical. It's, you know, and that's where you can just read it as we pick up fragments of, you know, stories or, you know, whatever from ancient Greece or wherever, and people are arguing over the meaning of it and its
Yeah.
place and everything.
Yeah, I
And
loved that. All that dog stuff they were talking about, absolutely loved that. That's what I really wanted to be reading was the dogs debating about the meaning of these stories and their own philosophies on life and what their society, how their society was built and stuff. I was intrigued by that, and I just was like, no, let's go back to the dogs. You know what I mean? I wanted to find out more about the dogs.
That's what I like about this, because you got that part, but you also got, okay, because this Henry Adams, who's the grandson of the atoms that went into the atom bomb and nuclear power, is rich, and he creates this kind of living museum, you know, of the city. And Ollie Johnson, who's going to create a dude farm or like a dude ranch thing where people can come to
farm, yeah.
farm and see how things work. What happened to all that?
Yeah.
You kind of wonder too. You know, all these little things you just, but you're not told. I don't want to get to Aaron's comment here. Like he liked Grant Stevens because there's humor in it, and it makes it very human, and that's the thing. And I think that's where Simak too. The story sort of the first story is almost a little outside of a lot of things, but it has its purpose and its place.
Do you mean like the first story is outside of sort of the realm of the rest of the stories? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, I would agree with that. That first story is kind of the odd man out, but it laid the foundation for a lot of the other stories. So like I see why it's necessary.
Sure.
Yeah. And then like Aaron and in his video too, he couldn't see, or he thought, as he says here, the war seems odd. But that's the thing. It's not war per se. It is to a certain extent, but it's the leaving of the cities because he inserted this material after Hiroshima. So therefore the atomic bombs were aimed at cities, and that was the idea. So therefore you take away the cities, you don't have a target. But then you take away everything else before that. You take away any need for resources. You don't need that. Atomic power does everything. You've got robots that will create and build anything you want. You've got cheap. You can remodel your house and have a new house every 6 months if you want to, because it's cheap and easy to do. There is, in many ways, all those things do take away the need or want for war, because people will have everything. Why would you want to go to? Why would people want to go? Maybe governments might.
Like the fight over resources is not going to be present. That's a big reason for war, is fighting over resources.
And then you got everybody happy and having everything you want, and you're going to tell them we're going to go to war. Are they going to agree with you? That I think is sort of an implicit. It's not explicit, but I think it's implicit in the story. And
I have a question. So I can't remember, in the first story, were the robots already doing everything menial in that first story? Okay.
No, the only thing is there's a robotic
lawnmower. Yeah. It was like the first steps
I remember
towards it.
the lawnmower, yeah. That's right. I couldn't remember if the robots were there in that first one.
And the whole thing is too, because that's another thing with Simak, his themes of technology has outpaced humans, ability to survive, not survive so much, to adapt to things. It's happening too quickly. But he's showing that if that does happen and it continues, it's like, they can't adapt.
That's actually already kind of happening with
Yeah.
our current technology, because we have all this instant communication, you know what I mean, and social media and all of that kind of stuff. And like on a social maturity level, we're not really able to handle that instantaneous communication and instant gratification of expressing how you feel right this second. We're not really handling that very well. And so that's kind of outpacing us on a social level. So our technology is outpacing us.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like I say, the specifics of his story don't really matter as much, like whether they're right or wrong, or
right. It's the idea.
Yeah, it's the idea of what they cause, or the effects of those things. So therefore, like I say, the war aspect, to me, it's a contrivance, yes. And there's a bigger contrivance later with the fourth story, which we're not there yet. I won't go into the details, but there's a huge contrivance, and that was the first story that was written. And the other thing is, like, the big question is, in my mind too, and a lot of people's, but there's no answer to this. How did this story develop? Did he have this idea at the beginning? Was it partially John W. Campbell seeing a few things, or was it just Simak viscerally writing stories on a certain idea at the time, but then realizing that, hey, there's something else here, and then bringing them more together? And because the fourth story, Desertion, was held back, that makes it think that, well, Desertion wasn't written as part of City as well. That's another story that sits, outside of the other stories, but they're pivotal. They're pivotal stories.
Yeah.
City, the first one, and the fourth one.
That's great. Did Asimov write, the famous fix-up novel Foundation? Were those written in order? Do you remember if those were?
I can't remember. I
can't remember either. And at what point did he realize, oh, this is all one thing?
I didn't realize Foundation was a fix-up novel.
But
Campbell did want him to do a future history. He did ask him to do a future history, so then he sort of thought he would base it on Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. But Campbell, I remember reading in Asimov's autobiography, Campbell told him, go home and write an outline, and that's not something Asimov ever did. He just let it go organically. So I think they were put together chronologically, but maybe something was written and held back. That I'm not sure. But there are changes again with it. It's like I, Robot is a fix-up novel, because you've got interstitial material with the fake newspaper man writing a history of Susan Calvin, and that ties the stories together.
Right.
Ties the ideas together.
Yeah. Before we go to the next story, I wanted to make sure I was struck by Simak's writing this time through as well. Excuse me. There was some stuff that reminded me of Bradbury, and I've got a paragraph here. It says, he plodded slowly down the dusty path that was all that remained of what a few years before had been a busy residential street. A street of ghosts, Gramp told himself, of furtive little ghosts that whispered in the night, ghosts of playing children, ghosts of upset tricycles and cantered coaster wagons, ghosts of gossiping housewives, ghosts of shouted greetings, ghosts of flaming fireplaces and chimneys smoking of a winter night. That's like Bradbury. It's really good.
I can see that. I'll tell you, I can see that, Scott. And I didn't think about that when I was reading it. But I'll tell you what, the further I got into this book, the more I kept thinking it sounded a lot like Isaac Asimov. I was like, this is very Isaac Asimov-ish. And Sean, didn't you say that Isaac Asimov had written a letter to Clifford Simak when he was living at home with his parents, and they were publishing the addresses, and it was to his dad's candy store. Do I have that story correct?
Started, yeah, in 1938.
So I'm thinking, did Asimov was like maybe Clifford Simak was one of his influencers?
A big influence, yeah, because in 1938, Simak published a story, or Campbell published a story, Rule 18, and Asimov wrote a large, and it was in September. The letter is in September 1938, Astounding, and he talks about how he didn't think it worked. The writing worked because it jumped
because of the pauses, the breaks.
Yeah, but then because he put his father's candy store address. Simak wrote him a letter directly and asked him, can you give me any idea of how to improve? So Asimov reread the story and then realized what he was doing, that he was leaving the pauses, and then he started to adapt that, and he adapted the style of that kind of writing for his own, and that became a lifelong friendship as well, through letters and then at conventions. There was something else I was going to say.
Yeah, Joseph has a comment there. I don't know how to put that up.
Yeah, the Foundation trilogy was written in the same order as the book, except the first part of the first book that was written for the book. Yeah, I thought there was something like that, and I couldn't remember. But yeah, so yeah, like usually fix-up novels do change things. There's a few other changes in City as well, very short things where after John Webster leaves the Bureau of Adjustment, and he meets the guy on the stairs saying that Gramp Stevens has a cannon, and we're going to fight back. The police are coming to burn everything down, but the guy sort of says something like, "Oh, the old guy Gramp that lives with you," or the old guy named Gramp or something like that. So he's changed that to make it sort of the guy knows, he knows exactly who he is, that it's Gramp Stevens. And then the other change was at the very end of the story. In the original one, it just simply ends. Oh, that's the wrong one. It simply ends. Let me find the ending of it here. It just simply ends. What the asked Adams, and there's a noise. It's that Dadburn lawnmower, yelped Grant. But in the other one, he adds to that, and saying that he was.
I've got it right here.
Yeah.
He says, "I always knew the day would come when it would strip a gear and go completely off its nut."
Yeah. So he added that to a little more comedy, but also too, it says something. It's like technology.
It's better, baby.
Can go off and cause problems as well.
Yeah, right.
And
Scott, I just realized you have YouTube up on your computer probably, and I'm like, that's smart. I'm going to do that so I can see the chat.
Oh, I'm just in the StreamYard thing, and it's showing the chat on the right here.
Yeah, make sure you don't have the volume, because you'll have a delay.
I had the volume turned off.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so yeah, it's like I say, there's a few other little changes, but he put in, like, retrospectively, even though he was disillusioned by the Second World War and humanity, and then he put the atomic bomb in and everything like that retrospectively when he did this. And again, he wrote this interstitial material probably sometime in the late 40s and very early 50s. They didn't write a huge lot during that time, because his first son, Richard, was born in 1947, and then his daughter, Shelley, I think it was born in 1951. But also in 1949, he became news editor of the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. So he was busy.
I've got a question.
Fascinating guy.
So sorry, I meant to ask this before, but I got distracted by the idea of being able to see the chat. When you were talking about the changes in the story, do you think that the changes he made impacted the story in any significant way, or do you think it was just a changing to like make it flow better?
No, I think that definitely it was major changes or additions because it set
Mhm.
up the whole thing of it made his idea of the city, his view of the city uh, more clear and more pronounced, as well as the whole conflict of why this was sort of happening, and sets up why people were leaving and how the whole situation in within that story just as itself, the people were not adjusting well, or some people weren't adjusting well. And I think
Yeah.
that it didn't need it for that, but it just reinforced everything. It's like adding all the doggish material. It just reinforces his whole ideas. And I think Brandy, you had said to me where you found the repetition of things sometimes a little um, difficult to handle because he repeats himself. But that's
Between stories, yeah.
yeah, but I think that's
Mhm.
part of it because again, it's because they're tales, or they're can be viewed as tales, and
Mhm.
as an allegory as well. But then also he wanted to reinforce, like, to hit it home with the editors for
Mm.
that. And also too, you got to remember that these stories, you wouldn't have read them back to back. There were
Right,
months between them as well. So you to kind of forget maybe what was in the other one, and then he just
right.
takes it a bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Mhm. Very
There
good.
was something else that I was going to say about the first story, and I just can't think of what it was.
Did I distract you?
Mhm.
Yeah, no. Well, I guess yeah, we can move on to the second one, huddling place.
Yeah, and
Um,
he uses that word huddling like in almost every story. There's just that word somewhere in it. It's like
I don't
in a
know
later
that.
story, there's like a base that humans are at, and it's like a huddling place, right?
Mhm.
So here he's calling a huddling place a city, right?
yeah,
Well, actually, in I can't remember if he uses the word in the first one, but he does use huddle. He said men used to huddle in cities, right? And
yeah,
then in this next one, now we're at a palatial estate outside of a city, but the story's called Huddling Place.
yeah, because they huddle.
Mhm.
He's huddling together at the
Yeah,
place as
right.
well. So
Yeah.
yeah, so
So it's like wherever humans are becomes a huddling place.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's set about 100 and almost 130 years in the future, and that's the one thing. There's huge time gaps between the stories,
Hmm.
and you have to you get a sense of what's happened in between, but not like no details again.
Yeah.
And so it starts out to me. This is my favorite story of them, and the way it starts out is just it's so poetic. The way he describes the the funeral
Mm.
um, of John. It was John J. Webster the second, I think it was.
Yeah.
Uh, Jerome Webster. Is it Jerome? I'm forgetting now.
Yeah.
But
Jerome. No, let's see.
yeah,
No, Jerome Webster is actually alive here. Let's see.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Anyway, go ahead.
Jerome
Yeah.
is the doctor. Yeah, he's the main.
Nelson F. Webster lay in the casket.
Yeah.
Nelson. Yep.
Bill's here. Hello, Bill.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah, so and it's basically it's a story again with
Mark. Hello.
Mark.
Oh,
It's a
hi.
story,
Cheers.
it's a story again about the Websters, and that's but then we see Jenkins the robot who appears,
Yeah.
and it like we've got the Webster who is he's basically retired. His son is going to be going off to Mars to become an engineer,
Mhm.
and he is a renowned surgeon. And
Hmm.
especially, we find out that there are Martians that there was a plague, and he helped them, and with his research was able. He did a lot of brain surgery.
Yeah. Talk about remote work,
Yes.
right? Because the guy he laments that he never goes anywhere.
Yeah.
You know,
But he did spend
he's
5
afraid to go places. Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
He did spend the time on Mars
Mhm.
during the plague. And this is the interesting thing, because people talk about how Simak couldn't predict. Well, he's sitting there and they're talking. He's talking to someone from Mars
Mhm.
in real time. What are we doing right here? It's
Yeah.
not three-dimensional.
Are
But-
you on Mars? Just checking.
Yeah.
I am.
Okay, all right. But yeah, you're right. That whole idea that he can have this career from where he's at. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but he's sort of retired now.
Mhm.
That's the thing, because the people
Yeah.
still did go to places, but the thing is, he finds out that he has agoraphobia
Mhm.
because when he goes to say goodbye to his son, he realizes that he doesn't want to be away from home.
Yeah, he's having a panic attack.
He is, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then he comes back and he writes this treatise. Like he does do his remote studying, but he asked people to come, and only 3 of them were able to do it. And so he thinks that humans have now developed this agoraphobia because they have left the city. So it was a downside of leaving the city.
And I really liked that
Mhm.
portion of the story. Actually, I liked the idea of exploring the consequences of such a radical change in the way that humans lived. I really did like that. I thought that should have been explored more. I would have loved to have learned more about what are the other things. You know, agoraphobia obviously was affecting a large percentage of the population, but what other things would have been side effects from that? You know, I would have liked to have seen more out of that story about those effects.
Yeah, well, that's
I felt
the thing.
shortchanged.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's what I mean. Like every story, there's so many things that you want to know
Right.
more,
Mhm.
and that's kind of cool. But
I think that's a sign of a really good story. You know, it leaves you thinking, leaves you considering that stuff.
Yeah. I agree, but
sorry, go ahead.
it really did disappoint me that I did not get
Mhm.
more. To me, like almost every one of those stories could have been a full novel with a lot more explanation, and you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like this one, I definitely would have liked to have known more about the effects of all that.
Mm.
So, you know,
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the thing, and that's where again he covers himself by saying, the doggish editors are saying that these are fragments
Right.
of a much
Mhm.
larger story, and
right.
not the larger story of
Yeah.
humanity, but
He
also
did put that together well. He really did.
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah.
So it's hard. I mean, it's easy to be reminded of Asimov here too, but this came way before, right? Way before The Naked Sun. The Caves of Steel and The Naked Sun. Remember, in The Caves of Steel, Elijah had trouble being outside.
Yeah.
And then
interesting. Yeah.
in the Naked Sun, you had a planet full of palatial estates, and they had the same fears that this guy has.
Clifford
And,
D was definitely an influence here.
yeah, so it's interesting. You know, I think this came about 10 years before, if I'm right. I think they were written in the mid 50s.
Yeah, I can't remember when.
The Asimov stories, and these were written in 44.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that while I'm reading, because when he's talking to his friend, the philosopher Duane, on Mars, because we're mentioning other things, he says he glimpses some Martian furniture and stuff, and it reminded me explicitly of the Ray Bradbury story in Martian Chronicles, where they talk about the house, the Martian house, and that. Every time I read that, I flipped in my mind to that story, and I can't remember which one it was.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's a really nice piece of technology too that he's kind of predicting too. He's able to go places in his living room, right? And I pictured, giant screen, almost like a three, not a 3D, but it's like the walls and the ceiling and the floor are all like showing images of, as if he was at this other place, right? And gosh, we're close to that right now.
Yeah.
For someone in their home to go to Hawaii or whatever and
I was actually picturing like holographic imagery, like as if he were in the room, as if they were in each other's room, is what I was actually picturing.
Well, I think
very
that's
cool.
yeah, I think it was that kind of thing, because he talks about that you can go to a theater to watch a play, or you could browse any library in the world.
Yeah.
You sort of can do that now, obviously, with the internet, but not in the same way of going there. And that would be interesting to be able to do that. That's where the internet hasn't quite caught up yet, where you can actually, in some ways physically interact with something else somewhere else.
Yeah. And then it's interesting that, given that, then Simak sort of explores the idea, well, what does that do to a person if you're not around other people ever?
Right.
And what you get is someone who's afraid to be around people ever.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
those Martians too. He didn't go into too much detail about the Martians, but I would have liked to have known more about that also, and how we came in contact with them, more about what they look like, because I couldn't really get a clear picture of Dwayne because there's not really much of them.
He's furry. Yeah. That's about it.
Yeah, he didn't give us a lot. That's great.
Well, the one thing he does give, and this is part of the whole thing, and this sets up the story of the dogs as well, is that the Martians, like Dwayne says, we never thought of medicine. We never thought of like science, in other words.
Right.
They did think of philosophy in a scientific way, that they made a science out of it, not just of possibilities. It was actual concrete science.
Now this sounds like a book for Scott. That one right there about the Martians, scientific philosophy.
That'd be fun.
But the other thing is too, it's the idea is that those two races can come together, and one can help the other. And like he says, he's working on a theory or a philosophical thought that will change everything, and that will, and then even the central community of the Earth wants, the Webster to go and perform surgery, because Dwayne needs brain surgery and he can't. He doesn't feel like he can do this, and he says that the philosophy will propel humans 1,000 years into the future, and that is intriguing. But nothing else is said until later. Like, we do find out the consequences of that. See, there's always consequences to science in this story. There's always consequences.
Yeah, for sure.
And I wanted to know what Dwayne philosophy was, and I never got to know.
You do know the effect of it, what it causes.
Yeah.
And there's a description in the 5th story. Yeah, it's pretty close anyway. But yeah, and then the other thing is the final decision is not made by Webster.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing too, because technology did something that he was against his desire.
Yeah.
Even though it's not certain that he would have, hitched up his pants and gone and done it. It looked like he was on that road, but then it was the robot that said, "Oh, I sent them away because it's causing you pain." And that's an Asimovian story for sure. Like a robot story where the consequences of the rules, the consequences of the robotic laws cause an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, you're very right.
The other thing is too, there's an interesting, let me bend down here out of the way. This here is a
cool.
It's the Northeast Proceedings from 1971 in Boston, Massachusetts. And there's a discussion in here between Isaac Asimov and Simak called The Robot's Place in Society.
Nice.
And Simak says here, like he says, I will take a few more observations, then I'll turn it over to the man who really knows about robots, meaning Asimov. But in science fiction, many writers use robots as machines, which is entirely legitimate. They are machines. They can be used as machines. In other cases, other writers, myself included, have used robots not as machines, but as surrogates for of people, or perhaps even as actual people, perhaps as the kind of people that people should be.
Hmm.
And that's Jenkins, and
Interesting.
evolving. He's evolving through these stories. And the other thing that I was going to say is the whole idea, like Simak was so disgusted with, as I said, the war and humanity. He wanted to create a fantasy world where you could go, where things were better.
Mm.
And the work and the thing is about uh, the working together with the Martians and each complementing each other is sort of another part of Simak's thing of the brotherhood of beings, where everybody there's more common things than not, and if you work together, you can achieve things,
Mm.
and that's where we find out a little more of what that could mean in the other stories, but we've got something else that sort of stops that again.
Yeah. That's
No
one of
spoilers.
one of the very best things that science fiction does, by the way, is give us examples outside ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So here's something that is different from all of us that can let us look at ourselves better.
Yeah, and Jake, and that's where he uses robots.
Mhm.
Robots a lot of time in Simak are more human than humans,
Mm.
and people have criticized him for that. But that's
Can you
that's
be more specific about him? What can you give me some examples of when you're talking about making the robots to be more human than humans? Like
well,
that he does.
Jenkins, where he develops, he becomes the better human
Hmm.
for
Yeah.
what he does to a certain extent.
He's a
But he also
Webster,
makes
right?
mistakes. Sorry.
He's a Webster.
Yeah, he's a Webster. Yeah, he's a
Mhm.
Webster. And also too, Asimov had done that. Bicentennial Man,
Oh, I
where
love Bicentennial Man. That was so good.
yeah,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
like a lot of his robots, they become a better human to a certain extent, or
Mm.
strive to be a better human,
Yeah.
than rather than the just a
I guess I
machine.
got kind of the opposite. I guess I came to an opposite but similar conclusion of what you're talking about there. So I felt like the idea was that because he was a robot, he ended up becoming better than what a human could be, which would not make him more human than humans. It would just make him a better version of what humans might have been if they hadn't been human. You know what I mean? It was just like man created the robot, and you want your children to be better than you. And so Jenkins being better than humans is kind of like this idea that we created something that ended up being better than us, which is what you want your children to be. Essentially, that was the conclusion that I came to anyway.
Yeah, no, that works as well. Yeah, because
Mhm.
the thing is that but he makes mistakes as well. Like he makes
Mhm.
mistakes throughout, and that's why in one of the stories. Well, again, I can't.
You
I
can't
don't
say anything.
want to spoil it, but we'll get there. But again,
Yeah.
like I say, this was published in July 1944, Huddling Place, and there's hardly any changes until the very end. In the original publication of Huddling Place, Jenkins sends away the starship, but he says, "I had a rather strenuous uh, time, sir," said Jenkins. "They were so insistent that finally, much as I disliked it, I resorted to force. But I finally persuaded them that you never win anywhere."
Mm.
And
Wow.
that doesn't quite fit in. Well, it could have fit in, but then he would have had to make changes. He would have had to show how Jenkins changed from using force, because that's another thing that is part of Simak's thing is hatred and killing. He doesn't really like it that much, and that's how.
Yeah. How
Well,
interesting.
so I'm glad he took that out of there then, because the force isn't in the version that I read.
No, it's not here. I'm
So
looking at it right now. He just says,
I'm glad he took
I
that out.
didn't. Yeah. He just says, "I didn't think, sir," said Jenkins, "that you would want to be bothered. It was so preposterous. I finally made them understand you could not possibly want to go to Mars."
Yeah.
And then he adds on Webster's comment of that he's trapped.
Yeah. Right. And it's good that he took that force thing out, because as because I finished the stories, I'm not going to give anything away, but for the way the rest of the stories go, it would have been, in my opinion, inappropriate for Jenkins to have used force, especially at that point in his development. I mean, at that point in his development, he wouldn't have been, I think, emotionally cognizant enough to decide that he needed to use force to accomplish the task of sending these people away. So yeah, I'm glad he took that out. I don't think that works for
that's a very
the
interesting thing.
fix-up novel.
Yeah.
So these stories both came out in the same year, right? You said in 1944, and it's unclear to us if they are connected. He would have known they were connected because there was a Webster in both. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, at that point, but you see that the first one, Desertion, is a very odd one out, and that was the first one written in 1943. So how does that connect to the other stories? So that it only
connects. In the fifth story, you see how it connects. But you're right. He wrote that and then maybe saw this as a whole and started writing the whole. Yeah.
I see a lot of things in the stories throughout the rest of the book that connect to that first one. Like, I won't say, since we're not discussing the other stories yet, but there are a number of things I'm like, oh yeah, because in the first story, this was the result of that in the first story. You know what I mean? There's like a number of things, that come up.
Yeah,
he
that's interesting.
The seeds for all of the major things in the other stories. He plants the seeds for all of the things are in that first story. Like the seeds for the things in all the other stories are in that first one.
Yeah, this is a good point from Leon. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Simak wanted us to think robots are better or even equal. Jenkins is introduced with a mistake.
Yeah, he does.
Make more. Yeah, see that could that is a valid point. Like his mistake of letting them go, but to use force for it would have been too much, I think, for the character.
Definitely.
And it's not that. I think it works out because Simak does say that he does think that robots were or can be used as a better surrogate, or as he says, a surrogate for humanity, and he's able to use them to say things where he can't have humans say, and it doesn't work with the story. It's like, let's just go to something like Twilight Zone. Rod Serling, he got in trouble for writing stories about racism or anti-race against racism on TV, and people didn't really like it. So there's an interview that was done, and they were saying, "Oh, are you going to do any of these?" Oh, no, I'm not going to delve into those kind of things. It's just going to be about aliens and stuff like this. So he uses aliens in these stories to get across the idea, and that's where Jenkins and that's where Simak uses robots a lot to get across the ideas that he wants to put across. Where if he had humans do it, it would be maybe unbelievable and or uncharacteristic, but a robot is acceptable, or at least he thought it was, I think.
Well, and also in his stories, the robots live so much longer than humans that they would have time to think through a lot more things with all of that time to think things through. And a human doesn't live that long in comparison. So that again makes sense that he would want to use robots as his, voice for, the voice of human nature, or whatever you want to call it. So
and it gives him, like you said, it gives him a character that spans the stories.
Right.
Yeah, and that's where, see, you kind of wonder too. It would be nice to know how this sort of developed in his mind, and he doesn't really talk about this. He kept notebooks. He kept some notebooks, or sporadically, about ideas or developing of stories, but also a notebook of like saying that he got $50 for
Mm.
desertion. There's that kind of thing. But during this time, he didn't have any notebooks,
Mm.
and like you were looking at the John W. Campbell letters. There's nothing in there, but Campbell did write long letters to Simak, and Simak kind of, in one interview, he says he got kind of tired of reading these 12-page letters, uh, but
Yeah.
the other thing, well, it would be interesting because the University of Minnesota has his archives, and there are letters from John W. Campbell there. So I really wonder. But the thing is, Dave Wixon, who edited the 14-volume short stories and the Open Road Media City, doesn't talk about that. So I'm assuming there are no letters of them discussing City or the development of it. So it must be. I would think that it must be all in his. It was in Simak's mind.
Mm.
But how did it start? Did he write the first City story as just? Well, he wrote Desertion, and then he wrote these other ones quickly, and and I think they developed as it went along. And then by the time he got to the third story, Census, I think that's where he must have known where he was going with it, because and then Desertion fits in with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the thing. There are mutants, but yeah, I don't want to deal with that right now because
Yeah.
that sort of
Mutants are coming. Mutants are coming.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
They have their place, and there's a reason for that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't want to deal with that right now. The other thing is Thomas Clarison, an academic who he taught at Worcester University or University of Worcester or whatever it was called. He interviewed Clifford Simak a lot, and he wrote quite a few things about Clifford Simak, and he believes that, like, John W. Campbell had this view of science fiction that technology, and there'd be like a linear progression of advancement of humanity out into the universe. City is the first to turn that on its head and say, no, humanity is sort of a dead end, or could be a dead end. And that, he says, because there was nothing really written prior to that was similar, and it only story started being written after City was after the stories were being done. Now,
Mm-hmm.
does it mean Simax was the influence of that, or did the war influence other people like it influenced him? That's an interesting thing, and I don't know. You'd have to look at what other people who wrote similar types of things on that kind of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
What they say, how they came about it. Did they read um, City and see that yeah, there's a different way of writing, and that's why the simple way, as it was called in the book, the eighth tale, uh, Campbell didn't want. And I won't go into it, but it's just he didn't like the idea of what happened to the earth in that story.
Interesting. Yeah.
I would comment, but since we're not talking about that story, I'll refrain.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's my problem here. I keep thinking about the other stories. You know what I mean? I want to make comments about.
I know, and then that's the imperfect thing of this, because we could do that, but it's just next week is the next two stories, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
build on the
Yeah.
for that. But it's yeah, it's it's my favorite science fiction, I guess, book. But it's not like that's the thing. But there's ones that I think are better written and will have more depth. But the thing with Simak stories is, and many people have said this, critics have said this, to describe the plot and the story is simple, but there's a lot more beneath the surface there, like the philosophy.
Yeah.
You can't dismiss the story simply as space opera or anything like that, and that's where he had a bit of a problem with space opera, or at least he thought it developed um, in a better way from the pulp stories of pure space opera, and it took a long time to do that. And he was one of the ones that did do it, and he I think he was, and he thought he matured these stories. With these stories, he became a mature writer.
Mm.
Prior to that, he feels that he was fumbling around. He did
Interesting.
his own.
That's cool. So I have this John W. Campbell letters. There's a paragraph in a letter he wrote to Simak, and it says, the men I've mentioned are known and respected generally. They aren't as speculative, actually, as some of the other men who are not yet widely recognized for their work. Hal Clement, for instance, and Ray Jones, Cliff Simak, and Eric Frank Russell. You and your compeers are communicators. You want to think out an idea and communicate it. There is no more effective communication channel than fiction. Fact discussions are not as powerful.
Mm.
And I agree with that sentiment for sure.
Yeah.
So do I.
So what he's able to do here in a story
Mhm.
opens up way more than if this was a series of articles on these subjects.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's where sometimes the hard science fiction sometimes falls down because
Yeah.
it gets too caught up in the details. But Hal Clement, he's got the details, but there's the implications. Like he's got more to it than just the details and the science.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's a science fiction I like best. It's more than just stuff happening. It's more than the plot. Just like you're
Yeah.
describing, that's my favorite. It's the stuff that leaves me thinking, that opens doors to new ways of thinking. That's what science fiction does best.
See, and I have the opposite favorite science fiction. I like all of the sciencey stuff. I want to know all the details
the
about how
sciencey
they
stuff.
work.
I love that too. I love hard science fiction,
Yeah.
and that's included in this, right? Those are ideas as well.
In City?
So I'm talking about in general, and I'm just talking about general hard science fiction, as opposed to, let's say, a space opera, right? A space opera is less interesting to me.
Oh yeah, I
than
100%.
an idea story,
Yeah.
right? And the idea
Totally
can be
agree.
philosophical or it can be scientific.
Something to explore instead of just like you said, just the events taking place.
Yeah. But then you can have a space opera on the surface with so much, and
Absolutely
Hyperion.
Yeah.
Hyperion.
And Babylon 5.
Good example.
Yeah. Is another one where it's space opera on the surface, but there's so much depth below it. And
absolutely.
But Simak, another thing is that his characters were not generally scientists. They were not, doing huge things. This is like a farmer, like a typical story could be a farmer who has a little workshop and he tinkers and builds a spaceship. Doesn't make sense, can't be done, but that's not the point.
Right. Yeah.
The point will be something else. It's the same, and that's where Isaac Asimov's robot stories, they are contrived to get an idea across. To like he created Asimov created the 3 laws of robotics, or actually 4, but 3 laws of robotics, and then he tries to tear it down. He tries to tear them down.
Yeah, every story is that, isn't it? Tearing it down. Yep.
Which doesn't make sense, but that's not
because it sounds like such a good idea, to have them follow these rules, and then he's like, "Here's why it's not a good idea." Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know, what our future is, but I know my phone is often doing stuff that I do not want it to do.
Yeah.
And so if I get a robot in my house, yeah, that's gonna be a tough day.
Yeah, right.
Mm.
well, the other thing with Simak is like he's usually called a pastoral writer, and like included in that is is Ray Bradbury, but that dismisses a lot of stories that Simak has done that is not that way. There's aspects of it, and that's where I want to get to the locations of everything here too,
Mm.
in a second. But he's done cosmic horror. He's done all sorts of things that sit outside of the normal pastoral thing. But he grew up in the southwest corner of Wisconsin at the confluence of the Mississippi and Wisconsin rivers, and he never really liked going back as an adult because he realized that the hills um, wouldn't be as rolling, and the hollows wouldn't be as deep or dark, and everything, and the rivers, everything wouldn't be quite like his memory was. But that's
Mhm.
where the Webster estate is in his mind, in where he grew up in the
Oh,
southwest corner of Wisconsin. Now, my
interesting.
question is, what city is city set in?
Hmm. Not Minneapolis?
Nope, I don't think so. And it took me many years to actually do this until I visited that city.
Ah, okay.
Well, do tell. I have no
Okay,
idea.
where is Gramp Stevens and them are aiming their cannon at the Loop,
The Loop, right.
Chicago.
Chicago. Wow, cool.
Chicago, is that where that
Mhm.
is?
I think so because I've never come across anywhere else that's called the downtown area the Loop.
Mm.
Interesting.
And but I've never read this. Nobody else has addressed this. But it was like when I was in Chicago and you see the Loop, and there's just I don't think there's anywhere else. It has become sort of a euphemism for a downtown area. But
Interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. I just imagined it being a small town for whatever reason. It never occurred to me it was an actual, like, a large city.
yeah, well, I think he did, but he didn't name it. That's the thing. It's just
Yeah.
the only clue to me is the Loop, and I think that's the only place, unless somebody else knows anything else. But it took me like I always wondered where it was set, and then when I was in Chicago, buying books when I had my bookstore in the early '90s, and they were talking, and then I learned about the Loop, and I go,
Mm.
bloody
So,
hell, that's where it is.
That's where it
somebody in the comments is asking, is it London?
Yeah, well,
is.
but the other thing is too, if it's Chicago, isn't I think I'm sure it is one of the Empire stories of Asimov. The character in Chicago is part of the story as well. So
Hmm.
I wonder. I don't know if there's any connection there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, Alex is asking which edition of City is your favorite. Well, I like covers. I like the original Ace cover with the I can't remember the artist's name, but with the robot sitting at the desk. And then I like the later '80s version where it's Jenkins is sitting kneeling at a campfire with dogs around. But at that point, if anybody has that edition, there is a printing error in huddling place at the beginning. They put a sentence that's three days below up above,
Ah,
and repeating that in editions for many years. They
wow.
never used it
Hmm.
for some reason, and I don't know why. But the edition that I really like, I guess now, is the most complete. Is this one here?
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
don't
that's a nice
fully.
cover.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it works to a certain extent, but I just don't
Yeah, that
care.
city. Yeah. Well,
It's
who's the
kind of,
publisher of that one?
This is Old Earth Books. Yeah, Old Earth Books. It was a small publisher. It's out of print now. They did City and they did Way Station.
Hmm.
You know what that cover reminds me of is The Wizard of Oz. The yellow brick road with the Emerald City in the background.
I don't know. Does it say? Well, I'm sure it should say the artist here. Book designed by Robert T. Garcia. Cover art by Douglas Klauba. Klauba, I guess. Yeah.
Cool.
I don't like the cover of the ebook. It looks very menacing.
Well, it's the same. Like they all have these short story ones that all have this. Yeah, I just don't really care for them so much. The short stories.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I just looked at the cover of the ebook. It is menacing. The robot's eyes are red, like it's
like it's evil and there's going to be a robot takeover.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this one sort of makes more sense. Like this.
I know where that comes from, but still, it's an odd choice to me.
It is. Mm-hmm. It makes sense, but yeah, it just yeah.
Right. So we're going to do Way Station later this year, right?
Yeah.
And what are the other two?
In May, let me see, March, April. Yeah, May. Is it Way Station or is it All Flesh is Grass? I'm doing them in order, sort of.
Okay.
Which one was 63 and one was 67, and I can't remember if Way Station was 63 or 67.
Okay.
Or was it?
I can look that up.
It's just my brain's not.
That's okay. Let me look it up for you here. So let's see. Way Station 63.
Yeah, so
All Flesh is Grass 65.
Or 65, yeah. So that it'll be May will be Way Station, and then All Flesh is Grass September, and then will be the Werewolf Principle in November.
Excellent. In November, you say? Okay. November for Werewolves. Werewolf November.
Edgar's upstairs with Paddington. It's more comfortable sitting here than the hard thing that I have to sit on upstairs.
You bet. Well, I'm looking forward to all these. This is great.
Yeah, and the interesting there's an interesting which I don't have it to hand here, but I've been looking at reviews, contemporary reviews of City, and there's no sort of really lengthy reviews, but there's one. I will have it for the next one for sure, and read it out fully. But there's this one guy saying, "Oh, it's a great story, but he's no H.G. Wells. You know, if he took a little more time on his ideas, you know, he could have written a really good story for the ages." And I'm paraphrasing here. And then he says, "But maybe he had to buy a new washing machine or something like that."
Wow.
And then somebody in New Zealand does the exact opposite and says this stands up to H.G. Wells as a prophetic story.
I would listen to that reviewer right there. Put that one on your list.
Yeah. But it's interesting that, you know, it's such diverse views for it, and it still has that. You look, like I glanced through you know, Goodreads, and there's people just saying it was horribly written, they couldn't get anywhere in it, and it's just concept bad and all this stuff, and I'm going, how is it? It's like even Simak says he cringes, like in this foreword that he wrote in 76, he cringes a little bit at certain paragraphs, and that he could write better now, and he could have rewritten it, you know, to a style, but he says he's a different person. It would change the whole idea.
I imagine it's that way for all artists of every type.
But Van Vogt didn't believe that. He just tinkered with everything.
Yeah. Well, there's George Lucas, right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing that Spielberg, he did something with E.T., I think, and he really regretted it. He said, "Oh, I should have left that alone." I have no idea what exactly he did, but I remember seeing a thing in an interview of him where he was like, "I wish I had left that alone."
Joseph D says, without going to spoil my copy, yes, most all of them have the dedication to Scooty or Scotty, I guess it is, who was Nathaniel. The only description we have of Nathaniel is a small black dog. Do you happen to know the breed? Well, Simak's dog was what do they call it? Scots, or what is it?
Terrier, Scottish Terrier.
Yeah, Scottish Terrier. So I'm
Mhm.
assuming Nathaniel is the same. That's I'm assuming because we
Yeah.
don't have anything else. But if it was who was Nathaniel, then must have been a Scottish Terrier.
Mhm.
And yeah, I forgot about that because yeah, that is the dedication.
Interesting.
Mhm.
I guess
Yeah.
I didn't make that connection to that being his dog.
Yeah, no, it's the only dedication that he ever. I think it's the only dedication, or there might be one other dedication, but no, it might be the only dedication that he ever did with any of his books.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Mine has the same one. In
Yeah.
memory of Scooty.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, he liked dogs, and I guess that must be where the idea for the doggish editors came.
Mhm.
It's a parody, obviously, but it
Mhm.
is funny reading it too. And why is it funny? To me, it's funny is because you recognize the same arguments in academic scholars,
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
and we know what is wrong. We know what the actual story is.
Yeah. That's
Where
interesting coming from a journalist too.
exactly,
Cliff
yeah.
Simak was a journalist, right? So it says a lot. There's a lot to be said for what he's putting out there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The that just reminded me of Aaron was asking. I haven't actually replied to his um, question in his video. He was asking about what Simak did during the war. Like, did he? I don't believe he ever saw any active service. He did do something, but I don't think he ever has talked about it. But he basically started working in 1938 or 39 at the Minneapolis Star uh, Tribune, and he stayed there until 1976 until he retired.
Very
Uh,
good.
he became news editor, but then I think in the late 60s, early 70s, he relinquished that because he wanted to spend more time writing
Hmm.
because it
Is
just
there a biography of Simak?
no. Well, the only thing is now if I can reach it here. Oh, is something that was self-published by a Scottish academic um, lawyer um, called Clifford Simak, an affectionate appreciation.
Hmm.
And he
Nice.
got to know Simak during the 80s when he was over doing a conference in New York, and they became friends. And he also edited a number of collection in the UK here.
Hmm.
And it's not an academic thing. I do
Mhm.
have a book that is more academic. Um, part of this, it's part of the Milford series. But when the fires burn high and the wind is from the north, the pastoral science fiction of Clifford Simak.
Hmm.
And this one is much better, even though this guy he was an academic, but he doesn't go in an academic way of describing a lot of detail. If anybody wants to know about Simak country, and that's what it's called, because Simak uses the southwest Wisconsin area for even place names as well as topography, especially in way station. The topography is in a very uh, controlled and concentrated way in way station of the area where he grew up and place names. And
Very
it's good
good.
with that.
Mhm.
It's just he needed a better editor because there's
Look
self-published
at that. That's
by
great.
Amazon, or not Amazon, but
Mhm.
self-published. And Dave Wixon said in the early '90s that he was working on a biography, but
Hmm.
Haven't seen anything.
And he is he the executor or what is he?
Yeah, he's the executor of the Simak state, but he's also the executor of Gordon R. Dixon as well.
Oh,
which,
interesting.
which
Okay.
they were friends, and I haven't read that much. I've got quite a few now books by Gordon R. Dixon, and I want to sort of re-look at him and just see
Hmm.
if there's any connection sort of between them. And
Uh,
actually just literally found out that Gordon R. Dixon was Canadian.
hmm.
I didn't know that.
Okay. Very
Um,
cool.
but yeah, this is the closest. But it's not. There is biographical material in here, but it's not solely biographical because they
Hmm.
had discussions um, with every time he went there. And the thing with Simak was that everybody, like, yeah, Scott, you've read The Astounding by Vela. What is it?
Yes, Alec Lee.
Yeah,
Yep.
and that
Hmm.
paints a very bad picture of the golden age of science fiction,
Sure. Yeah.
and that was his aim. He clearly was he had an axe to grind, I think.
Hmm.
And there's so many mistakes in there, but we won't even get into that. But you know, people have read that and just hated everything to do with classic science fiction or golden age science fiction.
Sure. Yeah.
But everything that there's nobody that has ever said anything bad that I can see of that knew Simak.
Hmm.
There's nothing unless something comes out in his biography that he has hidden. But you think by now,
Hmm.
things would have come out.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only thing is he has been criticized because uh, there's no women in City, basically,
Hmm.
or very little, and a lot of his stories don't. Other than in Cosmic Engineers, the person who saves the universe or our universe is a woman,
Hmm.
but they seem to forget that part.
Gotcha.
But
Well,
yeah,
good. Hmm.
yeah, this was published not too long ago, a few years ago, in 2020. This one here. So yeah,
Cool.
so that's the
Hmm.
first two stories.
Yeah. Looking forward to the rest.
Yeah, and like I say, it's kind of thing. Anybody who's reading along, I'm hoping that they enjoy it. Read it for what it is, and not like a prophecy of the future. Even
Yeah.
though
Mhm.
sometimes people are right, they get things right. And the thing is with people who use technology and try to do that, they're usually wrong. But when they talk about human nature and certain things, sometimes they get things right there,
Mhm.
or more often, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's fun. Really enjoy it.
Yep.
Yeah, and so are you gonna? I know Scott's gonna do Way Station. Are you gonna do Way Station in May?
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll do Way Station as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's short. It's short, so that's
Mhm.
that's the one thing.
Well,
It,
that's the
these
other Clifford Simak book that I have is Way
Yeah.
Station. So
well,
Well,
you've
those
got
are the big two, right? City and Way Station are his big two. Yeah. The ones
yeah,
that everybody knows. Yeah.
you've got Project Pope as well.
oh yeah,
Uh,
that's right. I forgot about that one. I do have Project Pope. I might read that one too then. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
that'll be September. Yeah, that'll be
Yeah.
September.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, if
Love
there's
it.
wait a few seconds to see if there's any other questions from anybody else. And like I'm still sort of reading stuff about Simak. It's one of my lifelong things, and I'm just sort of trying to collect everything. So as we
Maybe
go
maybe
along,
you should write a biography.
it it would be nice, but the problem is to get the material. Like
Mm.
I didn't know him, and to do justice to something like that would take a long time. And
Mhm.
I know his daughter. I think his daughter is still alive. She's a retired librarian, I think, in Texas. Um, she
Mhm.
originally was an editor or journalist for a while. His son Richard has died, He was an engineer, I think a chemical engineer, and his younger brother Carson died in I think 2008 or something as well. So, but it's just difficult to, like I know people do write biographies without actually going places and seeing people, but they're not very good biographies.
Mhm. Yeah.
This would take a lot. I would like to write something about him, and that's why I'm collecting everything that I can that's been written about his stories, and see if anybody or has it all been written. Like there are a lot of articles, but there's no. This is the only full book, but basically it goes into vast sections and just telling you what the story's about.
It's just like a survey of it, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not really, and then you do get the other articles like Thomas Clarison has written stuff about him, and then there's some critical material which is kind of interesting. But then sometimes the critical material gets just a little too bogged down in academia as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I just want to collect there. I want to see what other people have said.
For
See if
sure.
I can add anything new.
Okay.
Very good. Very good.
So yeah,
All right.
if you want to stick around a few minutes, guys, and
I can't actually. I have an appointment in like 40 minutes, and I would like to throw some makeup on before I go to it. So,
All right. Be careful out there.
okay. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.